The candle nearest Evelina Marsh went out first, and nobody moved to light it again. "Say that again," said Alistair Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, setting down his glass with a click that silenced the entire table. "I want to be certain I heard you correctly." Evelina did not look away from him. She had practiced not looking away from men like him for 3 years now, ever since her father's ledgers had turned from black to red and then to nothing at all. "I said I intend to marry into this family," she repeated. "Since you mean to take everything my father built, I mean to take a piece of what you have. A fair trade, I think." Laughter came from somewhere down the table, quick and ugly. Alistair did not laugh. He studied her the way a man studies a horse he suspects of lameness, looking for the weakness that will explain the strangeness of the animal's gait. "Have you lost your mind?" he said at last, and it was not a question, it was a verdict. He picked his glass back up. The matter, as far as he was concerned, was closed. Evelina smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who has already decided what she will do and is only waiting for the room to catch up. 3 seats down, Julian Voss set down his fork and did not laugh at all. 2 days earlier, Evelina had walked through the front doors of Ashcombe Hall with a leather folder under her arm and a plan that had seemed reasonable in the coach and increasingly desperate with every step across the marble floor. The folder held everything that remained of Marsh Shipping, a dozen unpaid notes, a warehouse lease about to expire, and a letter from the Duke's solicitor informing her, with excessive politeness, that the Voss family intended to absorb what was left of her father's business into their own holdings. Begging had never worked for her mother, and it had certainly never worked for her father, who had begged the sea for one more good season and received a storm instead. She had come to negotiate. She was very good at negotiating with men who underestimated her, which was, in her experience, nearly all of them. The Duke's study smelled of leather and tobacco and old money, the kind that had been old for so long it had stopped noticing itself. Alistair Voss sat behind a desk twice as wide as it needed to be, and he did not stand when she entered, which told her everything about how this meeting would go before either of them said a word. "Miss Marsh." He gestured at the chair across from him without looking up from his papers. "I understand you wish to discuss your father's debts." "I wish to discuss my father's business," she said, remaining standing. "There is a difference." Now he looked up. His eyes were the pale gray of a sky before rain, and they moved over her face with the same lack of urgency a man might show while deciding whether to finish his tea before the rain actually arrived. "The business no longer exists in any meaningful sense," he said. "What remains are the debts, and those, I am afraid, come to my family by right of the notes we hold. You may keep the warehouse cat, if there is one. Everything else transfers by the end of the month." "You mean to strip it for parts and sell the name?" "I mean to recover what is owed. If you have a sentimental objection to arithmetic, that is not my concern." Evelina had rehearsed several responses to cruelty of this particular flavor. She had not rehearsed one for a man who delivered it so calmly, as though he were reading her a shipping schedule rather than the end of everything her father had spent his life building. Something in her chest went tight, and then, strangely, loose, the way a rope goes loose right before it snaps. "Then I will find another way to keep what is mine," she said. "You are welcome to try." He returned to his papers. Most people find that impossible things remain impossible, no matter how firmly one insists otherwise. She left without another word, because she had learned long ago that the last word in a room like that one belonged to whoever held the deed, and it was not her. But she had also learned, from watching her father lose everything one polite letter at a time, that there was always a second door if the first one closed. She simply had not yet decided which door she meant to use, until dinner that evening, when the Duke's mother pointedly asked whether Evelina had given thought to her prospects now that the business was finished, and something in Evelina simply refused to sit quietly through one more polite humiliation. She had said the words about marrying into the family before she had fully decided to say them, but once they were out, she found she did not want to take them back. Julian Voss found her the next morning in the East Garden, where she had gone to think without an audience and had instead found one anyway. He was nothing like his brother to look at, being fair where Alistair was dark, and slight where Alistair filled a doorway simply by standing in it. He had a way of walking that suggested he was always slightly behind schedule and slightly amused about it. "You meant it," he said, without preamble, "what you said last night." "I did." "Why me?" It was, Evelina thought, a fair question, and one she had expected from Alistair rather than Julian. She had assumed the younger brother would either laugh along with the rest of the table or ignore the whole business as beneath his notice. "Because you didn't laugh," she said. "Everyone else did. Your brother looked at me like I was a horse. He was thinking of shooting. You just looked curious." Julian considered this with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to most things. That's not much of a reason to marry someone. It's a better reason than most people have. He laughed at that, a real laugh, short and surprised out of him. "You're not wrong." They walked the length of the garden twice before either of them spoke of terms, and when they finally did, the conversation was almost embarrassingly practical. She needed the protection of the Voss name to keep Marsh shipping out of the melting pot of family debts. He needed, though he did not say it outright, some reason other than duty to eventually take a wife, some proof to himself that he had chosen a life rather than simply inherited one, the way he had inherited everything else in his brother's enormous shadow. "My brother will object," Julian said. "Your brother has already told me I've lost my mind. I don't think his opinion of the arrangement can get much lower." "That's not what I meant." Julian stopped walking. For a moment, the amusement went out of his face entirely, and something more careful took its place. "I meant he'll object because it will put you in this house. Permanently. And my brother does not do well with things he cannot fully control." Evelina filed that away without knowing quite what to do with it yet. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation," Julian said, and started walking again. "Take it as you like." The engagement was announced within the fortnight, faster than propriety strictly allowed, though nobody in the family seemed inclined to slow it down. The Dowager Duchess was, if anything, relieved to have her younger son settled with anyone at all, having quietly despaired of him ever showing romantic interest in a woman rather than his books and his horses. The staff took to Evelina with the particular warmth servants reserve for anyone who treats them like people rather than furniture, which she did, out of habit rather than strategy. Only Alistair kept his distance, which Evelina noticed more than she wanted to admit. He attended the family dinners where the engagement was discussed, offered the correct words at the correct moments, and otherwise behaved as though she were a piece of furniture recently delivered and not yet arranged to his satisfaction. It was 3 weeks before he spoke to her alone, and when he did, it was in the library, late enough that she had assumed the house was asleep. "You've done well for yourself," he said, from the doorway, before she had even realized he'd entered. A ruined merchant's daughter, married into a dukedom within a month of losing everything. Most women would call that a triumph. Evelina closed her book slowly, giving herself a moment before she answered. "You say that as though you disapprove." "I say it because I want to know what you're actually after." He crossed the room and stood closer than strictly necessary, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to keep looking at him. "My brother is gentle. He is also not particularly clever about people, whatever he may be with horses and ledgers. If you mean to use him as a stepping stone to something else, I would rather know it now. And if I don't, then I'll have wasted my suspicion, and you may enjoy watching me be wrong about something for the first time in recorded history." There was something underneath the words that she couldn't quite name, something that didn't match the coldness of his tone, the way a fire can burn under a floorboard long before anyone smells the smoke. Evelina found she did not want to look away from him, which frightened her slightly, given everything she had already decided about her future and the brother she intended to spend it with. "I don't need your permission," she said finally. "I never asked for it." "No," Alistair agreed. "You didn't." He left without saying anything further, and Evelina sat a long while after he'd gone, telling herself that the unsteadiness in her chest was simply anger, because anger was a familiar thing, a tool she knew how to use, and whatever else that conversation had been, she was not ready to name it. The wedding took place on a gray morning in early spring, in a chapel too small for the size of the family name attached to it, which suited Evelina perfectly well. She had never wanted a large wedding. She had wanted, if she was honest with herself, very little of what was actually happening to her, and had simply chosen it as the least bad of several bad options. Julian stood at the front of the chapel looking, for once, entirely without his usual amusement, and Evelina found that unexpectedly touching. Whatever else this marriage was, whatever practical bones held it together, he was taking it seriously, and that mattered more to her than she had expected it to. Alistair stood as witness, as tradition and his position demanded. He said nothing throughout the ceremony beyond what was required of him. But Evelina, walking past him on her way to stand before the priest, caught his eyes for half a second and found them fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with something he was clearly working very hard not to show. She looked away first. It felt safer that way. The vows themselves were unremarkable, the words every couple in England had said for 300 years, promises of faithfulness and care that meant, in this particular case, something closer to a business contract dressed in the clothes of romance. Julian's hands were steady as he placed the ring on her finger. His eyes were not unkind. She told herself that was enough, that it would have to be enough, because the alternative was to admit that some other feeling entirely had taken root in her chest during that half-second of eye contact by the chapel door, and she had no intention of admitting any such thing, not to herself, and certainly not to anyone else. The wedding breakfast that followed was a quiet affair, family only, the Dowager Duchess weeping with what she insisted was joy and not relief. Julian was attentive in the way of a man determined to do this well, refilling Evelina's glass before she asked, steering the conversation away from topics that might embarrass her, laughing at jokes that were not especially funny simply because she had made them. Alistair sat at the far end of the table and drank rather more than he ate. It was past midnight before Evelina found herself briefly alone in the corridor outside her new chambers, having stepped out for air that the crowded rooms below could not seem to provide. Alistair was there before she realized anyone else was awake, leaning against the wall with the particular stillness of a man who has been standing in one place for some time, thinking. "You're married now," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you." She did not move to go inside. She told herself it was because it would have been rude to simply walk away from him, though some smaller and more honest part of her recognized that as a lie even as she thought it. You've gotten what you wanted, then. The name. The protection. Marsh Shipping saved from ruin. I have. Are you happy? The question surprised her, not because it was unkind, but because it was the first entirely sincere thing he had said to her since the night of the dinner. She studied his face for the mockery she expected to find there, and did not find it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me again in a year." Something flickered across his expression, gone before she could name it. "I might." He pushed off the wall and walked past her, close enough that she caught the smell of brandy and something else beneath it, something warmer, and for one entire second, neither of them moved, standing close in the dim corridor, with the sounds of the wedding celebration still drifting faintly up the stairs behind them. Then he continued past her, and the moment closed like a door, and Evelina went into her new chambers and sat on the edge of her new bed for a very long time before she trusted herself to move again. The first months of marriage settled into a rhythm neither entirely comfortable nor entirely unbearable, which Evelina supposed was as much as most marriages of convenience could hope for. Julian was, true to his word, kind. He asked after her days. He took genuine interest in the recovery of Marsh Shipping, which under the protection of the Voss name had begun slowly rebuilding itself, ship by ship, contract by contract. He was, in every measurable way, a good husband. He was also, increasingly, an absent one. Estate business called him away with a frequency that surprised her, first to the northern properties for a fortnight, then to London for matters of business that he explained in vague and hurried terms before departing. Evelina did not begrudge him this. A dukedom the size of Ashcombe required constant tending, and Julian, whatever his easy manner suggested, took his responsibilities seriously in his own quiet way. But his absences left her, more often than either of them likely intended, in the company of his brother. It began innocently enough. Alistair managed the household accounts and the shipping contracts that overlapped with Marsh Shipping's recovering interests, and there were, inevitably, matters that required discussion between them in Julian's absence. A dispute over warehouse fees, a question about which captains could be trusted with the northern routes. Small, practical conversations that had no business lasting as long as they did, or leaving Evelina as unsettled as they left her. "You have good instincts," Alistair told her one afternoon, several months into the marriage, as they reviewed a stack of shipping contracts spread across his study desk. "Better than my brother's, if I'm honest, though I'd deny saying that if you repeated it. High praise, from you. I don't give it lightly." He did not look up from the papers as he said it, which somehow made the compliment land harder than if he had. "Your father would be proud of what you've rebuilt." Evelina felt something catch in her throat that had nothing to do with the papers between them. "You knew my father?" "I knew of him. Everyone in shipping did. He had a reputation for fairness that most men in his position considered a weakness. I always thought it was the opposite." He finally looked up. "You have the same reputation already. Fair to your captains, fair to your debtors, even the ones who don't deserve it. It's not weakness. I was wrong to think it was, when you first came to my study. Is that an apology, Your Grace?" "Don't call me that," he said, sharper than she'd expected. Then, more quietly, "Alistair, when it's only the two of us, please." She should have refused. She knew, even as she agreed, that something small and significant had shifted between them, a line crossed that could not easily be uncrossed. But she found she did not want to refuse, and that frightened her more than anything else that had happened since she'd walked into Ashcombe Hall with her leather folder and her desperate plan. "Alistair," she said, testing the shape of it, "then you may call me Evelina." Something eased in his shoulders, the way a man's shoulders ease when he sets down a weight he has been carrying without admitting its weight to anyone, including himself. The months that followed were a study in careful distances. Evelina made a point of never being alone with Alistair longer than business required. She made a point of writing to Julian faithfully during his absences, of greeting him warmly on his returns, of being, in every visible way, a devoted wife. She was not lying about any of it. She did care for Julian. She did want the marriage to work, wanted it with a fierceness that surprised her, precisely because she suspected, somewhere beneath the careful distances she was maintaining, that it might not. The trouble was that Alistair had begun to occupy a space in her daily life that had nothing to do with shipping contracts. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing, a captain's birthday, a preference for a particular blend of tea, the fact that she disliked being read to but loved reading aloud herself. He arranged, without ever seeming to arrange anything, for these small preferences to be quietly accommodated. She would find the tea waiting in the morning room. She would find a book left open to a passage he thought she might enjoy, with no note attached, as though the gesture would somehow be less significant if it went unsigned. She told herself this was simply his nature, a man who ran a household the way he ran his ledgers, with attention to every small detail. She told herself this for longer than was strictly honest. The staff, who missed very little, had their own opinions on the matter, opinions they were far too well trained to voice aloud, though Evelina caught the housekeeper watching her and Alistair together with an expression that suggested careful and sympathetic concern. It was Julian's own mother, in the end, who said the thing nobody else was willing to say. "You should be careful," the Dowager Duchess told Evelina one afternoon over tea, with the bluntness only a woman of her age and position could afford. "My eldest son has never in his life given his attention freely. He guards it the way other men guard their fortunes. If he has begun spending it on you, that is not a small thing, and I suspect you already know it." "There is nothing between us," Evelina said, too quickly. The Dowager Duchess studied her over the rim of her teacup with the patient skepticism of a woman who had raised 2 sons and buried a husband and had, over the course of a long life, developed a reliable sense for when people were lying to themselves. I did not say there was. I said you should be careful. There is a considerable difference between the 2 statements, my dear, and I think you know that as well. Evelina said nothing further on the subject, then or for weeks afterward. But she began, quietly, to take greater care in avoiding Alistair's company, scheduling the necessary shipping discussions for times when others would be present, keeping her replies short and businesslike when he tried, as he occasionally did, to draw the conversation somewhere more personal. If Alistair noticed the new distance, he did not remark on it, but she caught him watching her sometimes, across the dinner table, in the moments when he thought her attention was elsewhere, with an expression that looked very much like a man losing something he had never quite let himself claim. A year passed in this fashion, careful and controlled on the surface, and Evelina had almost convinced herself that the careful distance had worked, that whatever had briefly flickered between herself and Alistair had been starved into nothing by simple avoidance. Then Julian announced over breakfast on an unremarkable Tuesday that he would be traveling to the northern estates for a full month, longer than any of his previous absences, to oversee a dispute between tenant farmers that had apparently grown serious enough to require his personal attention. A month, Evelina repeated. Perhaps longer. Julian did not quite meet her eyes as he said it, and something about the way he folded his napkin afterward, too precisely, too deliberately, struck her as strange, though she could not immediately say why. You'll manage well enough, you always do. Of course, she smiled, because that was what a devoted wife did, and reached across the table to touch his hand. Write to me. Often. I will. He left 3 days later, and the house felt different in his absence in a way it had not felt different during his shorter trips, quieter, somehow, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath along with her. The shipping business, as it happened, chose that same month to deliver a crisis of its own. A contract dispute with one of the northern merchants threatened to unravel 3 years of careful rebuilding, and the matter required detailed knowledge of maritime law that neither Evelina nor the family solicitor could adequately provide. Alistair could. Alistair, in fact, had studied precisely this area of law during his years at university, a fact Evelina had not previously known and found herself unreasonably moved to learn. They spent 4 consecutive evenings in his study, working through the contract line by line, the fire burning low, the rest of the household long asleep, and Evelina told herself each evening that this was simply necessary business, and each evening found the reassurance harder to believe. On the 4th evening, close to midnight, with the contract finally resolved and the immediate crisis past, Alistair set down his pen and did not immediately reach for the next document. "You've been avoiding me," he said, "for the better part of a year now." Evelina kept her eyes on the papers in front of her, though she had stopped truly reading them some minutes earlier. "I've been busy, as have you." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man exercising considerable effort to remain calm. "I have watched you find reasons to leave rooms I enter. I have watched you schedule our necessary conversations for hours, when the whole staff is present. I am not a fool, Evelina, whatever else I may be, and I would like, just once, for you to stop treating me like one." She finally looked up at him. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in shades of orange and shadow, and his face in that light looked less like the cold, composed man who had once told her she'd lost her mind, and more like someone considerably more uncertain, someone who had, perhaps, been carrying the same weight she had, in equally careful silence. "What would you have me say?" she asked, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. "The truth. For once, between the two of us, simply the truth." "The truth," she said slowly, "is that I am married to your brother. The truth is that whatever this is, whatever it has been for the past year, it cannot be permitted to exist, because if it exists, It destroys everything. Your family, my business, whatever remains of Julian's trust in either of us. The truth is that I have spent a year avoiding you precisely because I am afraid of what happens if I stop." The silence that followed was total. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour, its chime muffled through the walls, and neither of them moved to acknowledge it. "Then we are agreed," Alistair said finally, "on the nature of the problem, even if we cannot agree on its solution." "There is no solution. There is only restraint." "Restraint," he repeated, as though testing the word for weaknesses, the way he might test a contract clause for loopholes. "Yes, I suppose that is what we have been calling it." He rose from his chair, and for one terrible moment Evelina thought he meant to close the distance between them entirely, and some part of her, some part she was deeply ashamed of, wanted exactly that. But he stopped a full arm's length away, close enough that she could see the effort it cost him to remain there, and no closer. "I will not make this harder for you than it already is," he said. "You have my word on that, for whatever it is worth. But I will not pretend, when it is only the two of us in a room, that I feel nothing. I think we have both done enough pretending. Alistair." "Good night, Evelina." He left before she could find the words to answer him, and she sat alone in the dying firelight for a long time afterward, her hands pressed flat against the desk, as though the solid wood beneath them could somehow anchor her against everything she was suddenly, frighteningly certain she felt. Julian's letters arrived weekly, warm and ordinary, full of tenant disputes and small complaints about northern weather, and Evelina read each one with a guilt that sat in her stomach, like a stone she had swallowed and could not dislodge. She was not unfaithful to him, not in any way that could be named or proven. She had touched nothing, said nothing, done nothing that any court of propriety could condemn. But she knew, in the quiet honesty she allowed herself only late at night, that faithfulness was not only a matter of actions. It was also a matter of where the heart chose, without permission, to wander, and hers had wandered somewhere it had no right to go. She redoubled her efforts at distance after that night in the study, more successfully than before, precisely because she now understood what she was protecting against. Alistair, true to his word, made no further attempt to press the matter. Their conversations returned to business, brisk and necessary, though something had changed permanently in the space between them, an acknowledgement that could not be unmade even if it went unspoken. Julian returned from the north 3 days later than expected, thinner than when he'd left, and with a distracted quality to his manner that Evelina noticed immediately and could not quite place. He embraced her warmly enough at the door, kissed her cheek, asked after the business and the household with what seemed like genuine interest. But something sat behind his eyes that had not been there before, a watchfulness she did not remember from the man she had married. The tenant dispute, she asked that evening, as they sat together in the small drawing room reserved for family. Was it resolved? Eventually. Julian did not elaborate, which was unlike him. He had always, in the year of their marriage, been generous with the details of his travels, happy to describe the northern landscape or the particular stubbornness of a given tenant farmer at considerable and often unnecessary length. This new brevity felt like a door quietly closing. "You seem tired." "I am tired." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her chest tighten with something close to fear. "Evelina, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Her stomach dropped, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Of course. Has anything happened, while I was away, between you and my brother?" The question hung in the air between them, and Evelina understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that however she answered this question in the next several seconds would determine the shape of everything that followed, for all three of them. "Nothing has happened," she said, and it was, technically, true. "We worked through the contract dispute with the northern merchant. That is all that happened, Julian. I promise you." He held her gaze a long moment, searching for something, and she made herself hold perfectly still under the searching, the way a hunted animal holds still and hopes the danger will pass over it without noticing. "All right," he said finally, and something in his shoulders eased, though not entirely. I believe you. But later that night, lying awake beside him in the dark, Evelina understood that she had not lied to protect a fiction. She had lied to protect a truth she was not yet ready to name, and the difference between those two things felt, in the small hours before dawn, considerably smaller than she would have liked. The weeks that followed Julian's return brought a strange, fragile peace to the household. He seemed determined to re-establish the warmth of the marriage's early months, spending his evenings at home rather than away, asking after Evelina's days with something that felt almost like anxious attentiveness, as though he were trying to win back ground he sensed, without proof, that he had somehow lost. Evelina, for her part, threw herself into being exactly the wife he seemed to need her to be. She accompanied him to social calls she would ordinarily have avoided. She sat with him in the evenings over cards and idle conversation. She told herself, with the fierce determination of a woman building a wall brick by brick against a flood she could feel rising behind it, that this was enough, that steady kindness could grow, over time, into the kind of love a marriage required, even if it had not started there. Alistair, throughout this period, kept a careful distance of his own. Business that had once required their joint attention was quietly redirected through the family solicitor instead. When their paths crossed at family gatherings, he was unfailingly correct, unfailingly polite, and entirely absent of the warmth that had once made his attention feel like standing too close to a fire on a cold night. Evelina told herself she was relieved by this. She told herself that frequently enough, that she nearly believed it. It was Julian himself, strangely enough, who disrupted the fragile peace he had worked so hard to build. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, some 6 weeks after his return from the north, as they sat together over the last of their supper, "that perhaps we ought to travel. You and I, somewhere away from the estate, away from business, somewhere it could simply be the two of us for a while." "That sounds lovely," Evelina said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "I've neglected you," Julian said, with a bluntness that startled her. "I know I have. Estate business, the northern properties, all of it kept pulling me away, and I told myself it was necessary, and perhaps it was, but it was also easier than being here and facing whatever this marriage actually is, rather than what I hoped it would become." "Julian, let me finish." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was steady, sincere, entirely without the complicated undertow she felt every time Alistair so much as looked at her across a room. "I know this marriage began as an arrangement. I knew that from the first day, and I accepted it, because I thought, given time, it might become something real. I still think that. I want to try, properly, if you're willing." Evelina looked at his earnest, hopeful face, and felt something in her chest crack cleanly down the middle, half of it aching for the decent man in front of her who deserved so much more honesty than she had given him, and half of it aching for something else entirely, something she had spent a year trying and failing to bury. "I'm willing," she said, and meant that too, in the way a person can mean two contradictory things at once, and simply hope that time will resolve the contradiction before it destroys everything it touches. They began planning the journey for the following month, a modest trip to the coast, nothing grand, simply time away together to rebuild what circumstance and distance had left unfinished. For a few weeks, it seemed to Evelina that it might actually work, that steady effort and genuine goodwill might be enough to grow real affection where practical arrangement had first taken root. Then, 3 days before they were meant to depart, the fire at the London docks changed everything. The messenger arrived at Ashcombe Hall just after midnight, mud-spattered and out of breath, with news that the London warehouse, the largest of Marsh Shipping's remaining properties, was burning and had been burning for the better part of an hour before anyone thought to send word to the family. Evelina was out of bed and dressed before Julian had even finished reading the message twice, her hands shaking as she fastened her cloak, her mind already running through the inventory stored in that warehouse, the contracts, the ledgers, the physical proof of 3 years spent rebuilding everything her father had lost. "I'm coming with you," Julian said, already pulling on his boots. "Both of you should stay," Alistair said from the doorway, dressed and ready with an efficiency that suggested he had been awake and moving before the messenger had even finished delivering his news to the rest of the household. "The roads at this hour are poor, and there is nothing either of you can do at the warehouse that the fire brigade cannot do faster and more safely without an audience." "It's my business," Evelina said. "I'm going." Alistair looked at her for one long moment, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the argument itself, an old and complicated current briefly surfacing beneath the urgency of the crisis. Then he nodded, once, and did not argue further. "Then we go together, quickly." The ride to London felt endless. 3 hours of hard travel through dark country roads, none of them speaking, all of them watching the horizon for the telltale orange glow that would confirm the worst of what the messenger had reported. Evelina's hands were pressed so tightly together in her lap that her knuckles had gone white by the time they finally saw it, a smear of angry light against the night sky, growing larger and more terrible with every mile. By the time their carriage reached the docks, the warehouse was a wall of fire, and the street in front of it was chaos, fire crews and dock workers and curious onlookers all shouting over one another, the heat rolling off the burning building in waves that could be felt from 30 yards away. "The office," Evelina said, staring at the flames with something close to despair. "The ledgers, the contracts, everything is in the office at the back of the building." "Evelina, it's gone," Julian said, gripping her arm. "Whatever's in there, it's gone. You cannot rebuild a warehouse by walking into a fire." But she was already moving, some desperate and unreasonable part of her mind fixed entirely on the small iron strongbox in the office that held not just contracts but her father's original ledgers, the last physical trace of everything he had built before the sea took the rest of it from him, and she could not, would not, let those pages burn along with everything else. She had made it 3 steps toward the building's side entrance, where the fire had not yet fully taken hold, before a hand closed hard around her arm and pulled her back with enough force to spin her around. "Are you out of your mind?" Alistair's voice was raw, stripped of every careful, composed edge she had ever heard him use. "You cannot go in there. The ledgers are not worth your life." His grip on her arm did not loosen. "Nothing in that building is worth your life. Do you understand me? Nothing. You don't understand what those pages mean." "I understand precisely what they mean, and I am telling you they mean nothing compared to you standing here, breathing, in front of me." His voice cracked on the last word, and for one suspended moment, in the chaos and heat and noise of the burning warehouse, nothing else existed between them at all. Then, from somewhere near the side entrance, a shout went up. One of the dock workers, moving faster than caution should have allowed, had gone in after a colleague trapped near the loading bay, and the roof above that section of the building groaned with a sound like the earth itself splitting open. Alistair released Evelina's arm and ran toward the sound before she could speak, before she could even fully process what was happening, disappearing into the smoke and confusion near the side entrance while she stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs with a fear entirely separate from anything she had felt for her father's ledgers. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Julian held her back from following, his own face pale with a fear that mirrored hers, and together they watched the entrance where Alistair had vanished, waiting for any sign, any movement, anything at all. When he finally emerged, half carrying the trapped dock worker, his coat scorched and his face blackened with smoke, Evelina did not think, did not calculate, did not remember a single one of the careful distances she had spent a year constructing. She simply ran to him, and when he handed the injured worker off to the waiting fire crew, she threw her arms around him without a single thought for who might be watching. "You could have died," she said into his shoulder, her voice breaking. "You absolute fool, you could have died." "So could you," he said, his voice rough with smoke and something else entirely, "which is precisely why I went in after him instead of standing here arguing with you about ledgers." She pulled back just enough to look at his face, streaked with soot, his eyes bright with an emotion he had spent a year trying not to show her, and for one terrible, honest second, neither of them looked away. It was Julian's voice, quiet and strange, that finally broke the moment. "Evelina." She turned. He stood a few feet away, his face unreadable in the flickering orange light, and she understood, with a sick lurch of certainty, that he had seen enough, in that single unguarded second, to know everything neither she nor Alistair had ever managed to say aloud. The warehouse burned through the night and into the early morning, and by dawn there was little left to save beyond the outer walls and a portion of the northern storage rooms. The strongbox with her father's ledgers, as it happened, survived, having been moved weeks earlier to a smaller office building across the yard, a fact Evelina learned only after the worst of the crisis had passed and the exhaustion of the night had settled fully into her bones. Julian did not speak of what he had seen on the drive home, nor that evening, nor the following day. His silence was, in some ways, worse than any accusation could have been. He moved through the house with the careful politeness of a man holding himself together through sheer discipline, answering questions when asked, offering nothing further, and Evelina found herself unable to bear the weight of it for more than 2 days before she went to find him in his study, where he sat with a glass of brandy he had not touched, staring at nothing in particular. "Julian, I need to explain." "Do you?" He looked up at her, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I think I understood everything I needed to understand 3 nights ago, standing in the street outside that warehouse. I don't think there's anything left to explain. It isn't what you think. Nothing has happened between us. Not once, not in a year, not ever." "I believe you," he said, and the strange thing was, she could tell he meant it. "I believe that nothing happened, in the sense you mean, but I also watched my wife run into my brother's arms without a single thought for where she was standing, or who might see her, and I don't think that requires anything to have happened for me to understand what it means." Evelina had no answer for that, because it was true, and they both knew it was true, and there was no version of the conversation that followed where pretending otherwise would have done either of them any good. "I have spent this entire marriage trying to become someone you could love," Julian said quietly. "I told myself, given enough time and enough kindness, it would happen. I think some part of me always knew it wouldn't, not the way it happened for you, the moment my brother pulled that man out of a burning building. I just didn't want to be right about it. Julian, I do care for you. That was never a lie." "I know." He finally looked at her fully, and there was more grief in his expression than anger, which somehow made the whole conversation harder to bear. "Caring for someone and loving them are not the same thing, Evelina. I think you know that as well as I do, and I think you have known it for longer than either of us wanted to admit." He rose from his chair, leaving the brandy untouched on the desk, and walked to the window, where the gray morning light fell across his tired face. "I need time," he said, without turning around, "away from this house, away from both of you, to think about what happens next. I don't say that with any anger toward you, whatever you might expect me to feel. I say it because I think we owe each other, at the very least, the honesty we've both been avoiding for a year." He left the following morning, without ceremony, without explanation to the rest of the household beyond a note claiming urgent business, and Evelina was left alone in a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet, with a husband who had walked away and a brother-in-law whose feelings for her she could no longer pretend not to know, standing somewhere in the same house, waiting, as she was, for whatever came next. Julian was gone 3 weeks, and in that time, Evelina and Alistair did not speak of what had happened outside the burning warehouse, though the silence between them had a different quality now than the silence of the year before it. It was not avoidance anymore. It was waiting. Evelina threw herself into rebuilding what the fire had destroyed, working alongside the family solicitor and her own foreman to assess the damage, arrange new storage, and salvage whatever business relationships the disaster had threatened to unravel. The work gave her something to do with her hands and her mind that was not simply sitting in an empty house wondering whether her marriage had already ended in every way that mattered. Alistair kept his distance during those weeks, more thoroughly than he ever had before, though she caught him watching her sometimes across the dinner table, in unguarded moments, with an expression that had stopped even trying to hide what it meant. It was the Dowager Duchess who finally broke the strange, suspended quiet of the household, cornering Evelina in the small drawing room on a rainy afternoon, roughly 2 weeks into Julian's absence. "You look like a woman waiting for a verdict," the older woman said, settling into her chair, with the particular directness she seemed to reserve for conversations nobody else in the family was brave enough to have. "I suppose you are, in a manner of speaking." "I don't know what you mean." "You know precisely what I mean, my dear, and I would ask you to spare us both the trouble of pretending otherwise. My son has gone north to think. My other son has spent 2 weeks looking at you the way a starving man looks at a meal he has been forbidden to touch. And you, meanwhile, look as though you are being slowly crushed under the weight of a decision you have not yet allowed yourself to make." Evelina set down her teacup, her hands unsteady. "What would you have me do?" "I would have you stop asking other people what you should do, and start being honest with yourself about what you actually want." The Dowager Duchess's voice softened, just slightly, the sharpness of her manner giving way to something closer to genuine sympathy. "I have watched this family for 40 years, Evelina. I watched my husband marry for duty and spend the rest of his life quietly resenting it. I do not wish that particular unhappiness on any of my children, however unconventional the alternative might look to the rest of society. Julian is a good man. He deserves better than a wife whose heart wandered somewhere it shouldn't have." "Julian is a good man," the Dowager Duchess agreed. "He also, I suspect, already knows precisely what he deserves, and I do not think it is a wife pretending to a love she does not feel, out of guilt for a love she does. That is its own kind of cruelty, my dear, dressed up as kindness. I have seen it before, and it curdles, over enough years, into something far worse than an honest ending ever could." Evelina had no answer for that, because some deep and honest part of her recognized the truth of it, even as the rest of her recoiled from what it implied about the choice she had been avoiding making. Julian returned on a clear morning in early autumn, 3 weeks and 2 days after he had left, and Evelina knew from the moment she saw his face across the entrance hall that he had reached some conclusion of his own during his time away. "Walk with me," he said, before she had even finished greeting him properly, and something in his tone told her this was not a casual invitation. They walked the same garden path where he had first found her, a year and a half earlier, asking why she had chosen him, and not laughing along with the rest of the family at her desperate proposal. The irony of returning to that same path for what she suspected would be their final honest conversation was not lost on her. "I've had a great deal of time to think," Julian said, "about what I saw outside that warehouse, and about everything before it, all the small things I told myself I hadn't noticed, because noticing them would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit." "Julian, let me finish, please." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I married you knowing it began as an arrangement. I told myself, and I believe I told you as well, that given time, it could become something real. I still believe that, in the abstract. I think 2 people who are kind to each other and committed to trying can build something worth having, even from an unpromising beginning. But I do not think that is what happened here, and I do not think it is what will happen, no matter how much more time either of us spends trying to force it." His voice was steady, sadder than angry, the voice of a man who had made his peace with something difficult during 3 weeks of solitary walking through northern fields. "I think you fell in love with my brother somewhere in this past year, Evelina, and I think, if I am entirely honest with myself, some part of me suspected it long before that night at the warehouse. I think I chose not to see it, because seeing it would have meant admitting my marriage was already lost before it had properly begun." Tears were gathering in Evelina's eyes, despite her best efforts to hold them back, though she could not have said, in that moment, whether they were tears of grief, or relief, or some impossible combination of the two. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I want you to know that. Whatever else is true, I never set out to hurt you." "I know that," Julian said gently. I have never once doubted your intentions, Evelina, only the shape of what those intentions eventually grew into, without either of us quite choosing it." He reached out and took her hand, not with the desperate hope of a man trying to hold on to something slipping away, but with the calm affection of someone already saying goodbye. "I am not angry with you. I want you to understand that clearly. I am sad, and I think I will remain sad for some time, but I am not angry. You gave this marriage everything you honestly had to give. It simply turned out that what you had to give, in the deepest sense, already belonged to someone else. What happens now?" "Now," Julian said, "I think we end this honestly, rather than let it curdle into something neither of us can bear to live inside. An annulment can be arranged quietly, given the short duration of the marriage, and my willingness to cooperate with whatever explanation preserves the most dignity for all three of us. Marsh Shipping's protection under the family name need not end simply because our marriage does. I will see to that personally, whatever else happens between you and my brother." Evelina stared at him, this quiet, decent man she had married for practical reasons, and had genuinely, if imperfectly, come to care for, and felt a grief that was entirely real, even as relief moved through her alongside it. "You are a better man than I deserve, Julian Voss." "Perhaps," he said, with the first genuine flicker of his old amusement returning to his face. "Or perhaps I am simply tired of pretending to be someone I am not, in a marriage built on the same pretense. Either way, I think it is time we both stopped." The annulment proceedings moved with unusual speed, given the family's standing, and Julian's quiet, deliberate cooperation with every step required to see it through cleanly. Society, predictably, produced a great deal of gossip in the weeks that followed, most of it wildly inaccurate, some of it uncomfortably close to the truth, all of it eventually fading, as gossip does, once a fresher scandal arrived, to occupy the collective attention of London's drawing rooms. Julian left Ashcombe Hall shortly after the proceedings concluded, taking up residence at a smaller family property in the north, near the tenant lands he had grown genuinely fond of managing during his extended stays there. He wrote to Evelina occasionally in the months that followed, brief, friendly letters entirely free of bitterness, and she came, over time, to understand that he had meant what he said in the garden that morning. He was sad, he was not angry, and slowly, in his own quiet way, he was building a life of his own that no longer required pretending to be something he was not. Alistair did not come to her immediately, even after the annulment was finalized, and Evelina understood, without needing to be told, that he was giving her the space to grieve what had genuinely been lost, however necessary its ending had proven to be. It was nearly 2 months before he finally sought her out, finding her in the same library where he had first confronted her, over a year and a half earlier, about her real intentions toward his brother. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing in the doorway the way he had that first time, though his manner now held none of the cold suspicion it had carried then. "The night you first came to this house, I told you that you had lost your mind. I have thought about that moment more than I care to admit in the time since." "You weren't entirely wrong," Evelina said, setting down her book. "It was a rather mad plan when I first proposed it." "Perhaps. But you also turned out to be the most clear-sighted woman I have ever met, and I was the fool who couldn't see what was standing directly in front of him until he very nearly lost her to a fire he ran into without a second thought." He crossed the room slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, which she did not take. "I have loved you, I think, since that first night at dinner, when you smiled at my brother across the table with more courage than I have shown in my entire life. I told myself it was foolishness. I told myself it was impossible, unthinkable, beneath consideration. I was wrong about all of it." "Alistair, I am not asking you to answer immediately," he said, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, the same way she had that first night in the library, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "I am only asking you to know it, finally, plainly, without any more careful distances between us. I love you. I have loved you for longer than I was willing to admit, even to myself, and I do not intend to waste any more time pretending otherwise." Evelina reached up and touched his face, still faintly marked by the fading scar the warehouse fire had left along his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night neither of them had been able to keep pretending any longer. "Ask me properly, then," she said softly, "since you seem so determined to do this honestly." Something like hope broke across his face, transforming it entirely from the composed, guarded man she had first met into someone considerably younger, considerably more uncertain, considerably more her equal. "Evelina Marsh, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she had never been more certain of anything in her entire life. "Yes, Alistair, I would." They married the following spring, exactly 2 years after the disastrous dinner where he had first scoffed at her supposedly lost mind, in a ceremony considerably larger and more public than her first wedding had been, since a duke's second marriage to his own former sister-in-law was precisely the sort of scandal London society could not resist attending in person, whatever their private opinions of its propriety. Julian sent his congratulations from the north, along with a small wry note that read simply, "Some things, it seems, were always meant to happen the way they happened. I find I have made my peace with that, and I hope, in time, you both will as well." Evelina kept the letter in the same drawer where she kept her father's recovered ledgers, a strange and fitting pair of documents marking the 2 great turning points of her life. Marsh Shipping, fully rebuilt from the ashes of the fire, and further strengthened by the combined resources of the Ashcombe estate, grew over the following years into one of the most respected shipping enterprises in England, known throughout the industry, just as her father's business had once been known, for a fairness toward captains and debtors alike that most of its competitors considered an unnecessary indulgence, and that Evelina considered simply the only way worth doing business at all. Alistair proved, in the years that followed, to be exactly the husband his brother had once warned her he might struggle to become. A man who guarded his attention carefully but who, once given, gave it entirely, without reservation, without the careful distances that had once defined every interaction between them. He never fully lost the composed, commanding manner that had first made her think him cold and unreachable, but she came to understand, in the quiet honesty of their marriage, that the composure had never been coldness at all. It had been a wall built by a man who had never before found anything worth risking it for. Years later, at a family dinner not unlike the one where this entire story had begun, their eldest daughter, restless with the particular impatience of children who have heard a favorite story too many times to sit through it politely, finally asked the question that had apparently been building in her for some time. "Is it true," she asked, looking between her parents with the frank curiosity only a child can manage, "that Papa once told Mama she had lost her mind?" Alistair laughed, a warm and genuine sound that still, after all these years, made something in Evelina's chest turn over with quiet gratitude. "It is entirely true," your mother announced, in front of the whole family, that she intended to marry into it, and I told her, quite rudely, that she must have lost her mind to suggest such a thing. And then what happened? Evelina reached across the table and took her husband's hand, the same way she once had, standing in a corridor outside a wedding celebration that had, in the end, been meant for someone else entirely. "And then," she said, smiling at her daughter, at the life she had built from nothing but courage and a desperate plan, and the stubborn refusal to accept the first door that closed in her face. "I smiled, and I proved him entirely wrong, though it took the both of us a good deal longer than either of us would like to admit."